Well, good evening and welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study as we continue our walk through 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus. Last week we left off with the testimony of Paul and the heart of Paul being filled with gratitude because of the salvation that he himself had experienced for the call on his life to share the gospel with the Gentiles, that he himself had received mercy. And it seems to me that after this conversion experience that Paul fell in love with words that we love today, words like mercy and grace and faith and love. And when you read the New Testament, read the books, the epistles of Paul, you'll see these words repeated over and over and over in the 13 books that are attributed to him. 14, if you count Hebrews, and some people do. But these words appear as not a theme as much as a reflection of a life that's been transformed. And tonight, Paul is welcoming anyone that might wonder about Timothy's having influence or being empowered to be the pastor, the calling on his life. And as he welcomes them that are concerned about Timothy, he lets them know that Timothy is a favored one by the apostle and the apostolic authority that is given to Paul. And he begins tonight. We're beginning in verse 18, and Paul sort of reiterates the relationship that he enjoys with Timothy. He begins in verse 18. He says, "Timothy, my son," or my child. And it kind of gives us the idea of a small child. "Timothy, my son, my child, I'm giving you this instruction in keeping with the prophecies previously made about you, so that by them you may strongly engage in battle, having faith and a good conscience." There are three elements that I want us to first of all see in these verses that I just read about Timothy's assignment. Timothy's, we would call it his charge. We'd call these three principles of instruction, and each of them have significance in part because of the relationship of Paul and young Timothy, but more importantly, the relationship between Timothy and the Lord himself. The first, it seems to me that Paul's making a bit of a paternal appeal. He refers to young Timothy as my son or my child. You hear the tenderness behind the instructions that he's going to give. He's already given him advice. He's already said to Timothy, you need to stay tethered to the Word. You always come back to the Word, and that's great advice for any of us. But now he's using this tender terminology so that even the difficult parts and some of what we're going to read in the days ahead are very difficult. Even the difficult parts are more palatable because Paul's reminding Timothy of their relationship. He's reminding Timothy, I love you, I have a heart for you, and when I have these hard things to say, just remember that I do so because I care about you. The designation is a little bit of a subtle implication that the authority of Paul, when he says to those hearing this letter being read, "Timothy, my child," those who are reading it, there's a subtle implication that Paul's saying the authority I have rests in the one that I am referring to as my son. Most of you know the wonderful relationship that I enjoy with many that mentored me. And in particular, Dr. Bob Agee, who is a member of our church, and I've been blessed to be his pastor, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for him, but I also just have a tremendous amount of love and appreciation for his investment in my life. But I was one of a number of young men who belonged to a fraternity we would call ourselves a fraternity known as Dr. Agee's Preacher Boys. And one day I remember sitting in the Agee's home, not too long ago, and Nell was telling us some things that she was going through, and we prayed over her as she prepared for some additional cancer treatments. But in the conversation, Dr. Agee made a reference to his preacher boys, in which I'm very proud to be one. And he mentioned a name or two and what they were doing, how successful they were, and then he started talking, and so at some point, Nail spoke up and she said, "Bob, you really need to stop calling them preacher boys, because most of them are in their 50s and 60s." Well, Bob and I both understood that what she was saying. We aren't boys in the sense that, we're 19 anymore, 18, 19 years old, but we never stop referring to ourselves as his preacher boys. Just like I don't think Timothy is the least bit at all offended that Paul would refer to him as my son or my child, even though the Greek word does imply a small child. Timothy was had a paternal relationship with Paul. Paul was as his father in ministry, and I don't think Timothy ever took that lightly, and I think that gave to Timothy a certain amount of authority. Secondly, he also makes a prophetic appeal in this verse. He says, "I'm giving you this instruction in keeping with the prophecies previously made." That moment when there were hands laid on you. And in chapter 4, verse 14, there's a reference to that when Paul said, "Do not neglect the gift that is in you. It was given to you through prophecy with the laying on of hands by the council of elders." He was young, but he had some impressive credentials, and part of those credentials were who it was that invested in him, those elders that laid hands on him. And because of the prophecy that had been spoken over him, Paul said, you stand on the relationship that he enjoyed with Paul, the paternal relationship, the prophetic word that had been spoken over him, that sort of prophetic reminder. And then thirdly, he offers him more of a practical reminder, which surely would have strengthened Timothy because of the fight that was before him. After all, Timothy was well aware of what was going on in the world in which he lived, well aware that Nero was on a rampage, Christians were being persecuted, they were being tracked down, they were being fed to lions. The Colosseum was famous for that persecution, and that persecution was trickling down toward the lower provinces of Rome. In addition to what was going on outside the church in the attacks on Christians, wolves had entered the church and began teaching heresy and drawing a significant crowd. Timothy had to deal with that as well. And so what Paul was saying is, I'm giving this instruction, keeping with the prophecies previously made, so that you are strong in the battle, that you are strongly engaged in battle, so that when the battle lines are drawn, you'll remain firm in what God has commissioned and called you to do. The battle lines were being drawn, and today we are a church that sees that happening all around us. We talk often about a culture that's becoming less and less Christ-friendly, Christian church-friendly. The government mandates some safety. During this coronavirus, the government has mandated some safety regulations. We have to be very, very careful in the church, and this gets a little gray and maybe a little uncomfortable for some of you, but I think sometimes pastors have referred to either governmental regulations or governmental requests and made themselves or made their church out to be the heroic persecuted church. And I'm not altogether believing that that's in our best interest, because for me personally, I've not faced anything that I would call persecution. I've not been fed to the lions. I've not had a gun put to my head and told that I can't preach the truth. The shutdowns that we experienced, they weren't at least in our state, we were never told to do anything. We were asked to be considerate, and the pastors got together and sort of agreed that we would work together to keep, to flatten the curve was the goal. So getting applause is one thing, but to allow yourself to think that you were persecuted as the first century church was persecuted, or as churches even today in other parts of the world persecuted, I think that's a bit of a stretch. I don't know that doesn't happen, but I think it's more is attributed to that than should be. So the church just certainly, as Paul would say to young Timothy, they need to gird up their loins. They need to put on the full armor of God. They need to be ready to address what the church at Ephesus would be facing, because those things may come. I just don't know that they have come. Then he goes on, he says, some have rejected these and have suffered the shipwreck of their faith. And he names them. Hymenaeus and Alexander are among them. And I've delivered them, Paul said, to Satan, so that they may be taught not to blaspheme. Those that deliberately put away these principles of one's faith, they having good faith and a good conscience, but they put that away, it implies that their personal faith, in addition to what we would call faith in general, the Christian faith, basic Christian faith doctrines that have been put away, those are the ones we have to guard against. Those are blasphemous. Those are areas within the church that we have to guard against. He says as a result, their relationship with Christ has hit the rocks. They've not been tethered to the lighthouse or tethered to an anchor, or their eyes on the lighthouse, and that would keep the ship afloat when it's in perilous waters. They've abandoned the lighthouse. They've abandoned the tether to the Word of God, and it always leads to disaster. In other words, their ship has hit the rocks and is sinking. That's how he describes Hymenaeus and Alexander. These two apostates, Hymenaeus and Alexander, are mentioned later. 2 Timothy 2:17 says, and the word will spread like gangrene. Hymenaeus and Philetus are among them. They have deviated from the truth, saying that resurrection has already taken place, and are overturning the faith of some. Alexander's mentioned earlier or a bit later in 2 Timothy chapter 4. It says, Alexander the coppersmith did great harm to me, and the Lord will repay him according to his works. Both men were blasphemers, and they're just named by Paul. The fact that Paul has said that he'd given them over to Satan becomes a little bit of a difficult phrase for us to embrace, primarily because of today's culture. This is not the same as ecclesiastical discipline or excommunication, or the term that was used in the early 20th century called churching someone. This is not the same thing. Paul's exercising what is his prerogative and his position as an apostle. So when he says he hands these men over to Satan, in the way that Paul put these men out of the church so that they would no longer have the protection and the insulation of God's blessing. And when they're out of the church, then they're under Satan's control. In some instances, God has turned believers over to Satan. Romans certainly tells us that he gave them over to their reprobate mind. He does so in some cases for positive purposes, because he wants to reveal their authentic faith. Job went through a lot, not because Job was a person that God was chastising, but because Job was a person God could trust. And he wanted Job's faith to be evident to the world. Certainly God knows our heart. Sometimes he does it to reveal the authenticity of a person's faith. Keeps them humble, certainly that. Keeps us dependent on him. And sometimes it just is done to strengthen the people around us. But then there are moments like this where God hands one over to Satan for judgment, such as what he did with King Saul. Judas, on another occasion, who was had never been transformed. There was the sinning church member in 1 Corinthians 5, the first 5 verses, that that just is asked, is moved out of the church and out of its protection. All of that is as a judgment. And it seems in this passage these men are judged for their blasphemy. But when we read that Hymenaeus and Alexander among them, I've delivered them to Satan. But look what that last phrase says. It says, so that they may be taught not to blaspheme. Notice that Paul's ultimate desire is for them to turn from their apostasy. He wants them to learn, and Paul, nobody would know this better than Paul, just like he did. Paul knew that he was a blasphemer. He described himself as such, but he found grace. He found Christ, or Christ found him, and he found grace, and his life was transformed. And for Paul to end chapter 1 by saying, I delivered them to Satan, but with purpose, so that they may be taught not to blaspheme. One that was formerly a blasphemer would know certainly well. So there are folks that we are praying for, but we ought to pray for them. We're not we're not apostles, so we're not given the authority to excommunicate someone. We may have to exercise church discipline from time to time, all with a redemptive heart, which is the New Testament principle. And so we pray for folks that they are able to be redeemed. There may be someone in your life, you need to pray today for them to be redeemed, and this may be the year that the Lord calls them back to himself. And I'll join you. We'll pray. You let me know. I'll pray specifically, but in the meantime, we'll pray together that God calls those that are away from him back to him, and that their life is transformed. Look forward to next week, and I'll see you again on Wednesday night. Have a great night.